Ave Maria, Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, fructus ventris tui, Iesu. In this talk, I introduce an itinerary of a 1947 pilgrimage to Lourdes for working class people, organised by working class people. It was from Clydebank to Lourdes. Now, Clydebank people had made local pilgrimages, such as to Carthrine Grotto and to some places in the west of Ireland, but the south of France was a very long way away, especially in 1947, so soon after the end of the Second World War. The first page of the itinerary gives the date, 26th June to July 5th, 9 nights away, a novena of prayer. It lists the pilgrims, and it states that the leader was Mr. P. Cahill of Ollerton. Now, Ollerton is in Nottinghamshire. Who was this guy? Well, this guy was the very much younger brother of usher-trained Reverend Martin Cahill. And it was in a trunk that I inherited on his death well over 50 years ago that this itinerary schedule came. It had been keyed on wax stencil by Peter Cahill, his brother, who also had been at Usher to train as a priest until tuberculosis ended that. He was then a draftsman to Frank Whittle, the jet engine inventor. But after that, he was unemployed and remained unemployed until 1955. But what on earth brought Usher people to be involved in a pilgrimage from Clydebank? Well, it so happened that in 1946, Peter had happened to meet a woman who had come from Clydebank herself on pilgrimage. She was the person who really did all the work. Who was she? This is the earliest known photograph of her from 1945. She was Margaret McCann, a Clydebank suffragist. She had lost absolutely everything in the Clydebank Blitz. Indeed, she borrowed this fur at that time to dress up for a First Communion celebration. Who was she? Well, she was born in January 1909. It was soon discovered that she was unable, through bad eyesight, to get the regular factory work that a working class born girl would expect to get. So they educated her. The working class people did. She came under the influence of the Women's Freedom League, and from 1926 through to 1933, in other words, longer than the time it took to get the full vote for women, she worked alongside Lillian Lenton, the veteran suffragist, on the Clyde Coast campaign. Now, they weren't interested just in the vote. They wanted equality for women, and Margaret worked on that all of her life. Now, she quickly noticed that most working class women, indeed all working class women, were tied to the kitchen sink 24/7, even if they were in paid work. The only legitimate day off they got was if they went on pilgrimage. So she organised day trip pilgrimages. And during World War II, on top of her very onerous day job, she also volunteered in many areas, a lot of them helping women. But she suffered immense, massive war trauma herself. That trauma came more than anything else through the horrific bombing of Clydebank, the forgotten Blitz. So terrible, so much worse than Coventry that Churchill ordered it to be blanked from the history books, and to a large extent that is how it remains to this day. She needed spiritual healing. Now, a physical pilgrimage in the right mindset can enable the spiritual journey that can lead to healing. The second page of the itinerary lists where they would go in Lisieux and in Lourdes. It talks about transport, religious support, and how much people would pay. How on earth did she organise it? No working class homes had phones in those days. Everything had to be arranged using the mail, using written letters. And very occasionally, there'd be a phone message via a parish presbytery. She almost certainly also gathered in all the subscriptions from the pilgrims, and it would be in weekly installments. And she would have to make all the payments. So she was carrying a massive personal financial risk. She probably got advice, but probably not much more than that, as support from Martin and Peter. But were Margaret, Peter, and Martin really working class? Well, here's where she lived in 1955 to 57. And down on the right there in the picture, that's Margaret's father is somewhere amongst all these, an anonymous face amongst anonymous faces. And on the left, Peter and Martin's family were not any better. This photograph of the family was taken before their father was horribly killed in 1934 in a rock fall in the Ollerton mine. They paid full fare to go, although the chaplain didn't have to pay. They got grants to subsidise the young disabled, and there were plenty of young disabled in those days because polio, diphtheria, and other childhood killer diseases were endemic. The page 3 of the itinerary gives instructions, meal arrangements, how they should behave, and the constant prayers during travel from the moment they entered their overnight bus to London. And this bus, remember, is, as well as adults, it contains a lot of disabled young. And there were no motorways and there were no motorway service stations. The bus driver probably pulled into a lay-by every couple of hours on the long journey to London. And everybody would get some kind of fresh air and perhaps a stretch, and quite a few would go and seek the nearest hedge. There were no facilities. Despite all this discomfort, these pilgrimages from Clydebank grew in popularity. Over the years, Margaret organised many more. And you can see from this photograph of one of them that it's far more than one busload. The numbers must have grown, as they say. On page 4, what they would do in Lourdes, the text for prayers for the sick, the processions that would be a part of the ritual of this place of sacred waters. And what hymns would be sung communally by everybody from all around the world that had come to Lourdes on that particular time. Particularly, Immaculate Mary, our hearts are afire, that title so wondrous fills all our desire. Ave, Ave, Ave Maria, Ave, Ave, Ave Maria. Banal words in a banal tune, but everybody could sing it, and it is still today sung and known as the Lourdes hymn. What did they bring back, though? Very little. A few leaflets of prayers, brooches, medals, and of course Lourdes water, the sacred water of Lourdes. They came back via Paris and took a side trip to Lisieux. We don't know any detail of that side trip to Lisieux. That page is lost. They returned via Dieppe, and then the itinerary page goes on to advice on money. But we do actually know what they did in Paris, because by chance in 1967, Margaret retraced her Paris stay with a companion. and the companion's write-up survives. Here's a picture of her at Sacre-Cœur at that time, and we know that St. Vincent de Paul was another of the many churches on this 1967 tour, which replicated the 1947 day in Paris. Page 6 of the itinerary goes into hagiography, the link between Rue du Bac, the shrine of St. Catherine Labouré, who was canonized a few weeks after this 1947 pilgrimage, the link between Rue du Bac, Fatima, and Lourdes, that link being the idea of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. It talks about the right mindset for pilgrimage and what the pilgrims could expect to see. And it also begins travel advice. Don't fuss about food. Do carry out British water in the bottle. You'll later fill with Lourdes water because you'll need it. And it's going to be hot. So when you get there, get a Pyrenean hat. Finally, the last page that survives. It ends in the middle of a sentence. A bit more on the Lourdes site, including the fact that pious pilgrims are chipping off bits of St. Bernadette's home as souvenirs. And it starts the data of the Paris trip. And that is all we have, but that is a lot more, indeed, infinitely more than we have for most working class pilgrimages, volunteer organized at this time. Now, for the Clydebank people, there were no miracles. But on their very last day at Lourdes, a lady from Nice was miraculously cured of cervical cancer. That was miracle number 47 of only 67 approved Lourdes miracles since St. Bernadette first saw her vision in 1858. Margaret organised further pilgrimages right through until 1953 at least. There was an extra pilgrimage to Rome in 1949 to 50 for the start of the Holy Year. Commitments meant Margaret herself was unable to go. It was an enormous amount of work, quite apart from the financial risk that she was carrying through all this. And she was actually relieved when commercial firms elbowed in, so to speak. What she regretted was that the spirituality of the pilgrimages diminished. After each pilgrimage, well, medals were distributed, holy water was distributed. Margaret herself had brought home 2 gallons of water in a great big bottle, and her home became a centre of distribution for the local community of holy water, for the sick and the dying, in literally very, very little amounts each time, but that was all that people needed for the spiritual strengthening that Lourdes water would give them. And one crippled child faced death very happy. When I meet Jesus, he said, he'll make me able to run and run and run. Sancta Maria, Sancta Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus. Sancta Maria, Sancta Mater Dei, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. Amen. Amen.